What if the Iranian Revolution went differently? In our own timeline, Iran was beset with a revolution in 1979 aimed against the Shah of Iran Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who became a despot ever since the CIA-backed coup in 1953. The revolution saw the dissolution of the monarchy, ending almost 3 millennia of monarchical rule in Persia, later Iran. Ayatollah Ruhollah Musavi Khomeini would manage to take over the nation and turn it into an Islamist theocracy to this day. But what if that didn't happen? What if the revolution went differently? I split this video into 3 timelines with different outcomes. In the first timeline, the revolution was crushed, and the monarchy remained in power. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi remains in power until his death in 1980. His son Reza Pahlavi would become the new Shah of Iran at the age of 20. Maybe he might liberalize the nation. Alternatively, he might remain a despot. The Iran-Iraq War doesn't happen. Another outcome this brings with itself is that the Gulf War doesn't happen, and as I often explained in older videos, maybe even 9/11 doesn't happen. Iran remains a part of the Central Treaty Organization, or CENTO, with Turkey, Pakistan, and the United Kingdom. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, the United States didn't just support them through Pakistan but a slow Iran, and so it is possible that the National Islamic Front of Afghanistan would, if they reunite Afghanistan, restore the monarchy under Mohammad Zahir Shah. Without support from Tehran, Hezbollah and the Houthi movement would be much weaker and might not even exist. Iran would be closely allied to Israel instead of being its moral enemy. In this timeline, with the hostage crisis and the second oil crisis not happening, Jimmy Carter wins in 1980 against Ronald Reagan. In 1984, Harold Streisand became president, and he would go on to win on 1988. Unlike Reagan, who was a staunch neoliberal, Streisand was quite progressive and would establish a universal basic income and expand Medicare. This would make the Republican Party more moderate, compared to our own timeline. In 1992, his vice president George H.W. Bush would become president, followed by Bill Clinton in 1996 and 2000. In 2004, George W. Bush became president, and he is more conservative, both fiscally and socially, than his 2 predecessors, and while it seemed like the Republican Party might shift right with his presidency, his legacy was completely tarnished with the Great Recession, and he lost to Barack Obama in 2008. He would then go on to win again in 2012. In 2016, Colin Powell managed to defeat Democrat Hillary Clinton, and in 2020 Joe Biden, before dying in 2021. His vice president Phil Scott would become president. Iran might acquire nukes with permission from the United States of America. With Iran being allied to both Israel and Turkey, they probably don't oppose Azerbaijan in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, meaning Armenia is all alone and Russia would be waging Shahed drones, while Ukraine has them, which means Ukraine might do better and Russia worse. Without Iran supporting him, and potentially without ISIS, Assad might be doing worse in the Syrian civil war, and the opposition might manage to win. In this timeline, Iran would be closely allied to the United States and not be its enemy. This would be beneficial for other U.S. allies, and be catastrophic for enemies of the United States. Islamism would also be much weaker. In the second timeline, the revolution was successful, but instead of an Islamic theocracy, a democratic republic gets established. The first president of the Republic of Iran is Mehdi Bazargan. While not as close to the United States as the Pahlavis, they still keep close ties to them. It is doubtful that Iran would have a hostage crisis, like in our own timeline. Iran may or may not remain in the Central Treaty Organization. It really depends on how pro-Western the government is, but because of involvement of London in the CENTO, I'd say that they'll leave. Iraq may still invade Iran, but this goes horribly wrong, as in this timeline the United States support Iran and not Iraq. By the end of the war, Iraq was forced to unconditionally surrender. Saddam Hussein is overthrown and a democratic regime is put in power in Iraq under Ayatollah. Iran may also annex Iraqi Kurdistan, as Kurds are just like Persians, Western Iranic people. The Republic of Iraq is seen by many as nothing more than an Iranian puppet state. The Gulf War itself won't happen, and again maybe no 9/11. The Soviet Union would still invade Afghanistan, and Iran would support the Jamiat-e-Islami, who just like an hotel for an interim government with other groups and their leader Burhanuddin Rabbani as its first president, but unlike an hotel the Taliban fails to defeat them and the Islamic State of Afghanistan endures. In this timeline too, without an Islamic regime in Tehran, Hezbollah and the Houthis are much weaker, or don't exist. Iran would be friendly to Israel, but not as friendly as the Pahlavis, and like in the previous timeline Iran supports Azerbaijan and not Armenia. Maybe a Cold War between Iran and Saudi Arabia might still happen, but it would be between democracies and republics versus monarchies and autocracies. Iran would support the opposition against Assad, and this could lead to a defeat for Assad. The new Syrian Republic would align itself with Tehran. Iran would also become friendly with Lebanon. The Yemeni civil war wouldn't be between the government and Houthis, but rather the government and a democratic opposition led by the Social Democratic Yemeni Socialist Party. Just like before, they'd rather support Ukraine than Russia, which could make a difference. In this timeline, United States elections would be like in the previous one, so Jimmy Carter wins re-election in 1980 and Harold Streisand in 1984, ensuring a more progressive and moderate Republican Party. In this timeline, Iran would be a beacon of democracy, quite frankly the opposite of what it is today, and it would spread its liberal ideas to other parts of the Muslim world like Iraq or Afghanistan. In this third timeline, the Communist Party of Iran is the one to take over and Nurdin Kianuri becomes the new president of the Socialist Republic of Iran. The Iranian hostage crisis still happens, and isn't really any different than in our own timeline. The new communist regime in Iran would align itself with the Soviet Union. The Iran-Iraq war still happens, and while the United States support Iraq, the Soviet Union supports Iran, and they actually managed to win the war. Iran would establish a communist regime in Iraq, namely the People's Republic of Iraq under Aziz Muhammad. A Cold War between communist Iran and anti-communist Saudi Arabia would emerge, but that is just a proxy in on itself between the communist Soviet Union and anti-communist United States. In the Soviet-Afghan War, the Socialist Republic of Iran supports the Soviet Union and Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. Without their support, the Shia factions are essentially non-existent, but the Soviets still lose. The Taliban still takes Afghanistan over. The Kuwait War doesn't happen because Iran prohibits Iraq from doing so, as they don't want to be involved in a larger war. In 1991, the Soviet Union still falls apart, but just like Cuba, Laos, Vietnam, North Korea, and China, communist Iran and Iraq managed to endure. The Iranian regime would nonetheless be fairly isolationist. In 1999, Nurdin Kianuri dies and Ali Kaveri becomes president of Iran until his death in 2021. The communist regime in Iran wouldn't support Islamist regimes, but rather communist ones. In Lebanon, it isn't Hezbollah, but the Lebanese Communist Party, or LCP, that controls the south. In Syria, they would support neither side but might support communist militias and organizations like the Syrian Communist Party. In Yemen, instead of supporting the north-based Houthis, they'd support south-based communists. They probably also support the Marxist-Leninist Kurdish Workers' Party, or PKK, making them a greater threat for Turkey. Iran would probably be hostile to Israel as they are a close American ally and would support its enemies, probably also in the Gaza, especially as it contains many communist groups, like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Iran would be like China, friendly to Russia, as they both had the United States, and Iran would support Russia in its war against Ukraine just like in our own timeline. In Nagorno-Karabakh, they'd probably support Armenia like in our own timeline as well. Given that this state is secular, the killing of Mahsa Amini probably doesn't happen, but similar protests against the government and calls for the death of the dictator might still happen. In terms of United States politics, they'd be more similar to our own timeline, but without an Islamist Iran or 9/11, Islamophobia probably is smaller, whereas communism is more hated due to Iran, and the United States might become even more neoliberal than it was in our own timeline, so more like the visions of Milton Friedman. In this timeline, the situation isn't any different than in our own timeline, but instead of being Islamist, Iran is communist. In these three timelines, the route Iran takes changes, and it affects the rest of the world as well, with the monarchist and republican path being very similar and the Islamist and communist path being very similar. If you liked the episode, leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. Goodbye.